In this episode, I'm joined by Emma Weaver, Child Development and Neuroinclusion Advisor, for a discussion on neurodiversity in the early years. We'll explore how SEND presents in preschoolers.
We use the phrase emerging when we're talking about children in the early years because it's often when we start to see early indicators of SEND needs. We talk about watchful wait periods. Yeah. So it's an opportunity to observe, to reflect on what we're seeing.
And strategies that parents can implement to support your child's development at home.
I'm always thinking, what was the environment like? What was the expectation on the child at the time?
Yeah.
What did we want them to do? Just get them moving.
So let's begin. So welcome, Emma. Let's start with you telling us a little bit about yourself, your experience and your work.
Okay, so I don't really know where to start in the sense of where my experience and background in early years comes from. After leaving school, I went and studied early years, and it's been ever since then that I have built my career around early years, special educational needs. Worked in children's centres and Sure Start centres, worked in education, worked for a wonderful charity for a very long time where we specialised in neurodiversity and SEND, and right the way through that kind of period of time and throughout my career, I've worked with many families, many children and many practitioners as well that are working with individuals with SEND and emerging characteristics of SEND as well.
Perfect. Sounds like an obvious question, but what are considered the early years? Just for those people out there that might be wondering, what exactly is early years? Where does that go up to?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah. Early years typically we say is 0 to 5.
Yeah.
So from birth to 5 years. And it's that kind of period of early education, early development, and when we learn, do so much of our learning happens in those first 5 years as well.
Really, really quite important years then, aren't they?
Yeah.
So we hear a lot about the phrase emerging SEND in early years. What does that mean, and how might neurodiversity present in a child in early years? What might you see?
That's a great question. I think we use the phrase emerging when we're talking about children in the early years because the early years, there's such a rapid period of child development that happens, a rapid period of growth. So we talk about emerging because it's often when we start to see early indicators of SEND needs. Now, the challenge is it an early indicator of something that could be long term, or is it just an indicator of where that child's stage of development is at that point in their life and in their early childhood?
Okay.
So we refer to emerging because I suppose it's an opportunity for us we talk about watchful wait periods. Yeah. So it's an opportunity to observe, to reflect on what we're seeing, to kind of look at early intervention and support, to then have more of an idea as a child progresses. Is this going to be something that's going to be long term, or is it something that has been kind of supported with early intervention and strategies?
So would that, I mean, in my role, a lot of the questions, or not so much questions, but parents will say when they contact us for help and support, and they'll say, well, we think my child's got ADHD, but they won't even do an assessment until he's 7, I think, is what they say. Is that why, that is the case? Because it could just be down to these normal behaviours in early years that fluctuate and change, and is that why we watch and wait and see?
Yeah. And a lot of it is linked to the brain and how the brain develops in the early years. It goes through this rapid growth kind of in the first 5 to 6 years, where 90% of an adult brain is formed by the time a child reaches 5 or 6.
Yeah.
And in that time, children develop at different rates. So I've met children that will develop really fast in one area. We might see really kind of rapid physical developments, but we might see differences in speech and communication. But as a child progresses through their early years, those kind of strands of development might peak and trough, might change, and because of the nature of how our children learn and grow in the early years, we need to give opportunity to see how that's going to unfold, really.
We've had, we get asked a lot of questions, obviously, but we have a parent question for you, if you wouldn't mind having a go at this one for us.
Yeah.
So a parent with a 3-year-old has suspected ADHD, and they're asking how can they tell if he's experiencing a meltdown or if it's just a typical child tantrum. They're struggling with what is best to do in relation to boundaries, and she wants to understand what's right and wrong, but also can't cope with the meltdowns as she doesn't want to distress him any further. So is it a meltdown?
Yeah.
How do I support him to understand right and wrong? And should I be doing that if he's having a meltdown? And just really want some advice around that.
Yeah, it's a question we get asked all the time. And I think in my whole career of working in early years, that is one of the main questions we get from our parents. The challenge is, particularly when we're focusing on the age of 3, is when we look at typical child developments and when we look through the lens of like neuroscience and brain development, is when a child is 3, they're in what we call the stage of limbic brain development. Limbic brain is all to do with your emotions, your fight, flight or freeze. It's not very reasonable, the limbic system. It's very primitive. It's very reactionary. It's very impulsive. Doesn't often make a lot of sense. And that's all children of 3 are sitting in this kind of stage of brain development.
Okay.
When it comes to emotional self-regulation, we need to support our little ones to start to develop skills in self-regulation. And that takes time. That also takes maturity. And we know that when it comes to brain development and how the brain matures, it's not until our children start to enter into what we call the kind of stage of executive function development, which is like 4, 5, 6. Your executive functions are your skills in planning, organising, problem solving, reasoning, just checking with yourself, self-soothing. All of those things happen, but they don't come until much later in the early years. So it's working out, is it part of being 3, and is it part of we're in this kind of area of brain development where that's what's happening in the brain for all children of that age group? Or is it related to the child's kind of the way that they're interacting with the world and how they're processing information and how they're making sense of the information and responding to that information? And I think that's the golden nugget question sometimes, that it's trying to unpick that can be really tricky.
I guess a question that springs to mind for me going on from that, and it's maybe going a little bit off course here, but what is the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown?
Yeah,
is there an answer to that question or not?
Not always. No. And the reason I say not always is there's so many contributing factors. I've often referred to the term emotional reactivity. So sometimes the phrase tantrum often makes you think that it's quite goal directed. So a child is throwing a tantrum because they're wanting something or they're trying to get something. I've always gone down the route of behaviour is a child's way of communicating something to us.
Absolutely, agree, yeah.
So it's actually when they're emotionally reactive for a purpose or a reason. Now it might be, I can't communicate my wants and needs, so I'm becoming distressed because I can't tell you what I want. It might be that the environment's really overwhelming because there's maybe some sensory differences there where it's really loud, I'm feeling really overwhelmed by that. It could also be I'm 3 and that my brain, I'm tired.
And I don't know how else to get what I want or what, get my needs met.
Yeah, and I've had a really busy day at nursery and I've come home and I've come back to my safe space where I just kind of crumble a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is really tricky. And I think there isn't really a golden answer to it. I think what we need to do is look for the triggers. And I often say we have to do a lot of kind of analysis and looking at our children's behaviour to try.
Being a detective. I've heard that previously today. I think somebody mentioned about being a detective and working out what's going on here and, where did it come from?
Yeah. And I think sometimes having like a tick box in the back of your mind when you're being that detective. So I always think to myself when I'm observing children in settings or I'm talking to families and working through some of those behaviours and having those conversations, in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, what was the environment like? What was the expectation on the child at the time?
Yeah.
What did we want them to do? What was changing? Because we know...
Had they eaten? Were they hungry?
Did they sleep last night? You know, so sometimes when we work through that tick list in our own mind, we can sometimes pinpoint a trigger or we can pinpoint a pattern. When we've established what maybe the trigger is or what maybe that pattern is, that's when we then look at, well, what can we do to support that?
Yeah. Somebody once said to me, and I don't know if this is based on scientific fact or if it was just, somebody's sort of analogy of it, but somebody was having a conversation with somebody once and they said that they looked at tantrums or the difference being that a tantrum is typically a child who, they've spilt the drink, that they're overwhelmed by that the minute you've wiped the drink up and given another one, the tantrum is generally over. Whereas with a meltdown, it's a point of exhaustion, and it's a point of, I can't deal with this anymore. And they're unlikely just to snap out of it by you changing something. It normally comes to a natural end when they're worn out and exhausted.
Yeah.
So they don't know how to come out of it.
Yeah.
And it will end because they've completely burnt out.
Yeah.
They're exhausted and they fall asleep, or whatever, the ending may be. And I've often thought about that. It makes sense.
Yeah.
It kind of makes sense,
Yeah.
but I don't know how accurate that is. But I like to think of it that way.
Yeah.
It's just something that...
I think it makes you think as well about, and I've seen this in children when I've observed behaviours where you see something that initially is like, we refer to goal-directed kind of responses,
Yes.
or goal-directed behaviour that starts in that way, but then it turns into emotional
Something more,
dysregulation.
yes.
And suddenly the child is overwhelmed by these big feelings.
Yeah.
And those skills in self-soothing, those skills in problem solving aren't developed yet. So because they're only 3 and those skills come a little bit later, they need us as adults to co-regulate.
I was just going to ask
them.
about co-regulation. So I was going to say, is this a point where co-regulation would come in? So just explain a little bit, what is co-regulation?
Okay, so we can't self-regulate if we haven't had co-regulation initially. So co-regulation is our adults attuning to children. So it's when we see our children responding in a certain way, it's how do we then respond to
Yes,
that?
yeah.
That's the biggest challenge.
Showing them how to regulate by doing it with them.
Yeah. Guiding, being there at the time
Yeah.
that they need you, responding to them, being their safe person, allowing them to kind of respond, but also making sure that they're kept safe at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great way of explaining it. Okay, so moving on a little bit from that, what is the importance of movement related to physical development?
I could talk about movement.
I knew you loved this. So
I love this.
Yeah.
I think because my passion really is neurodivergence and emerging kind of characteristics of the likes of ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, all of those kind of neurodevelopmental differences. And what I've learned from a lot of my research, but also just from talking to parents, is stages of physical development and the how the stages of physical development present in our little ones with emerging characteristics of neurodivergence. So there's lots of research out there about primitive reflexes. I love them and I could talk about them all day long.
I have looked at this. I know we talked about it some time ago and I've been looking into it. So keep talking.
I think when you learn about primitive reflexes, so much makes sense. And I think that's what I love about talking about neurodiversity particularly, because when we strip it back to us being animals and that primitive response that we have as just humans and animals, it then makes sense as to why our bodies react the way that they do and why our bodies need certain things. So your primitive reflexes are something that start in the womb and they develop in the early years. Now, all people go through stages of primitive reflex kind of integration, they call it. So there's lots of them. So, for example, there's one called the Morrow reflex. The Morrow reflex is your startle reflex.
Yeah, well, you see new babies at the 6-week checkup, is it, where they kind of, is it not, they don't drop them, but they sort of move them back and they do the whole arms go out and Yeah, it's
like if you see a baby in a Moses basket and a big bang happens in the environment, they naturally do it like a starfish startle. And that is a primitive reflex that is present in babies at that stage of their development. You've also got another one called the Palmer reflex, which is when you put your finger inside the palm of a baby's hand, they naturally grasp the hand. There's the suckling reflex for feeding. Yeah. There's loads of them. But what happens is in a child where their primitive reflexes have integrated, they go into their early childhood with all of those reflexes aligned with each other. What research is telling us is that for some children with emerging characteristics of neurodivergence is they have what we call retained primitive reflexes.
Okay.
So a retained primitive reflex is where that reflex at the time that it was going through its typical stage of development didn't integrate in the same way. So they've held on to that primitive reflex. So what that looks like in a child that comes into our nursery settings or goes into year 1 or year 2 or older, we see retained primitive reflexes in adults as well, is that if there's, for example, a retained Moro reflex, they're a child that's really sensitive to sensory environments. So
easily startled, easily,
hypervigilant
makes
in
so
our
much
classrooms.
sense.
Yeah. Even children, when it comes to the palmar grip, if there's a retained palmar grip there, they might be a child that's really struggling with early mark making. They then go into our primary schools and they're struggling with handwriting. But what I love about primitive reflexes is we can provide intervention early on for all children, whether there's emerging sends that we find out kind of as they progress and develop or not, because it's part of typical development.
Yeah.
So
well, I know we haven't got time to go into it in a great sort of, in a lot of detail, but do we know what stops the development or the integration?
It can be a number of different things. So it can be related to environmental factors.
Okay.
I was reading some articles and research around, it can be birth as well, kind of experiences.
Traumatic birth or,
Yeah, twins as well. I was reading because I'm a twin, so I'm quite interested in like twin studies and things. And when it comes to those early reflexes that are starting to develop in the womb, when there's 2 of you, there's not as much space. So the ability to, so there's all sorts of research out there that is kind of informing us of this. And I suppose the role of an occupational therapist, and I'm not, I would love to be, but I'm not an occupational therapist.
Too late.
Yeah, I know, could be an area of study, but that their role is to really unpick that and look at those areas for some children as well.
That's brilliant insight. Before we move on, I'd just like to remind all of our wonderful listeners to like and subscribe to whichever platform you're listening to today. It helps to grow our channel and bring even more experts to the conversation around SEN, support and neurodiversity. Okay, so slightly different question. What impact does increased screen time and the use of technology have on a child's development?
Yeah, it's a question that's out there. And there's research happening about it now as well. And it's where we're at with society and where we're at with where we are in the world of technology. Technology is going to be here forever.
It's not going anywhere, is it?
Yeah. And it's about safe use of technology in the early years. Technology can be an amazing contributor to early education and childcare and development when used in the right way. I think when it comes to excessive screen time, that's when it can often create barriers for children's development. So, for example, if a child is sat watching YouTube or is on games or something like that on an iPad, they are missing out on opportunities for play.
For other things,
So
it's not the increase, it's not the screen time that's necessarily damaging, it's that you are preventing them doing other things that are important for the development.
Exactly. And we know that play in the early years, particularly children that have access to lots and lots of play with lots and lots of resources, when they're outside, when they're inside, when they're out and about in playgrounds, things like that, all of those opportunities are building what we call the architecture of the brain.
Yeah.
So if a child is spending too much time on the screen, they're not getting all of those opportunities. So it's not about saying we shouldn't have technology in the early years, because I think we should, because
it's there.
It's there, and children need to learn safe use of technology, and that starts early. But it's just about using it in a way that's not going to prevent those other opportunities that are important for development.
Great answer, Emma. Do you have any strategies that parents can use to support their child with physical and brain development?
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's reams of them, but some really key ones.
Yeah, so the field of early years, and if you go into now, we're seeing this in a lot of our early years settings. It's a lot of the advice that I'm giving in my role as around heavy work activities. So there's something in early child development called proprioceptive development. So it's all to do with your coordination and how you move around in space and in time. Children with emerging characteristics of the likes of ADHD and other neurodivergent conditions need additional input for proprioception. And proprioception is your body's push and pull It's your coordination. So if we can get our children in the early years doing lots of activities where they're crossing the midline.
Yes.
So lots of stretching, lots of crawling, all of this heavy work activity. I go into some amazing nurseries where children are pulling logs. I did, in a previous role, I did some work out in an international school in Germany, and they had this forest school approach, and all the children would move logs in the outdoor area to create seating spaces. And you'd see these tiny 3-year-olds lugging these logs across the outdoor space. But actually there was a purpose behind it. And the purpose was the more they pull, the more they stretch, the more they cross the body. All of that is developing the core control, but it's also having an impact on brain development, physical development that then leads to later development as well, and executive functions and how we support that development for learning as well. So it's so important.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well? Yeah.
So get them climbing. If your little one will do yoga, get them doing yoga.
Just get them moving.
Just get them moving, stretching.
Yeah.
All of those things are really important.
So replace some of that screen time with some movement and get your firewood in and things like that for you.
Get outside, get on the beach, get running. Like all of those things are just really important. And I think physical development is one of the foundations of then later development.
Brilliant.
So when we're looking at early child development, we're often looking at how a child is developing physically. So we need to give them as many opportunities to develop those physical skills, because once the foundations are there, we can then build on them. And that's why it is so important in them first 5 years.
Brilliant. That's a great answer. So we like to end our podcast, Emma, with a mythbuster.
Okay.
Lots of myths out there. So what's the most common myth, or the most, the one that you really want to bust?
Yeah. There's so many. I think the one that comes up time and time again for me in my role, and it's been over many years, I've worked with many families of little ones whose children are not speaking yet.
Yeah.
So I've worked with lots of families where there might be speech and language therapy support going in. It might be that the child's having additional support within their nursery setting, or home have been given strategies to develop communication and language. And I've worked with many parents that have come to me at the age of 3 where they've said, I've been told that my child is what we refer to as preverbal. Now, for a long time, preverbal was labelled nonverbal, and it was changed on purpose. It was changed to preverbal because preverbal helps us to think that there is the opportunity that
just
the child
haven't started talking yet.
Yeah. And actually that speech development takes time, and for some children it takes a little bit longer. So I think and actually communication isn't just speech. So I've worked with lots of families where we've done a lot of unlocking of understanding how their child communicates. They might not be saying words yet, but they're doing other things. There's pointing, there's gestures, there's hand leading.
Yeah.
They're still doing all of these amazing communication skills. They're presenting with all of these.
It just isn't verbal at the moment.
Just needs time.
Yeah. And the phrase non-verbal just suggests that they're just never going to speak because they are non-verbal.
Yeah.
I've heard recently it being referred to as, in fact, no, I can't remember now what it is, but there's several different forms now coming out where people are using different descriptions for it. But I think, it's important to remember that just because they're not speaking at the moment doesn't mean that that's a closed door.
Yeah.
We can't often see that. And in our schools, we've got children that speech, language and communication is, it's a significant area of need, but you see progress with the right support and the right strategies in place.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's where having worked in the field of neurodiversity for a long time, what I loved about that is we are referring to the strengths-based approach, and that there is opportunities for progression, however big or small that is. A child is progressing in their own unique way.
Yeah.
And actually that's we should be focusing on that. The fact that I've worked with children who will develop. I worked with a little boy a number of years ago, and I'll never forget him because he was preverbal. Within 6 weeks, I'd gone back into the setting, observed him again, and he was talking, he was using phrases, he was responding to questions, and that was in the period of 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
He was 3.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
And when I met him initially, there was kind of mum was particularly worried about his speech development and how will he communicate if he's not talking. And then literally within 6 weeks, he began to speak.
That's incredible, isn't it?
So yeah, and as I say, every child's different. Another child might not happen for them, but it's about recognising what is happening for them and those incremental steps that they're making, because they will be. They might not be these big leaps, but there will certainly
Doesn't matter,
be.
Yeah. It's a journey, isn't it? And for some it takes longer than others. But I think I've just remembered it was non-speaking that I keep hearing now. Non-speaking people, and however parents and carers describe that's their choice.
Yeah.
But we're hearing it called lots of things now, rather than just it being is non-verbal.
Yeah.
Or they're non-verbal. So. Yeah, very interesting topic.
Yeah.
And I think you've covered some really good points there and given some great advice to our parents. So thank you so much, Emma. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you today.
Yeah, thank you. Enjoyed myself. Thanks.
Thank you.